Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be going over some more logical fallacies, but before we start getting into the topic of more logical fallacies beyond the syllogisms we've been working with first, I'm going to just go over the answers for the homework really quick so everyone can make sure that they either did or didn't evaluate the logic of the problems I gave you correctly. So we're going to open that now and have a look at syllogisms we were working with before. Alright, so to start with, I'm just going to go into our first syllogism that we had. So, all fish can swim. In the statement, all fish can swim, we want to make sure that our circle representing fish is completely inside our swim circle, so that that indicates that everything that is a fish is also something that can swim. Then the statement, I cannot swim, that means that an X representing me has to be outside of the circle that represents things that have the ability to swim. And then the statement, I am not a fish. For this to be true, it has to be impossible for the X representing me to be outside of the swim circle and inside the fish circle. So that is actually the case because the swim circle completely surrounds the fish circle. So if I were to be inside the fish circle, I would also have to be inside the swim circle. So this is a valid syllogism. The logic here is not flawed. Next, people have two legs. So here our largest circle is going to be two legs, and then our smaller circle is going to be people. Again, people has to be completely inside the circle, labeled two legs, indicating that all people have two legs. Then our next statement, Paul has two legs. So we need an X representing Paul, and the X representing Paul needs to be inside the circle labeled two legs. Now, Paul is a person. For this to be true, the X representing Paul needs to be inside the circle labeled people, indicating that Paul is a person. Next, we need to consider if it's possible for the X representing Paul to be inside the two-leg circle and outside the people circle, which actually is possible. So that makes this syllogism invalid. Next, all squares are rectangles, so we need a circle to represent rectangles and a circle to represent squares. Next, all rectangles have four corners. Now, in this situation, what we need to do is have a circle going all the way around our circle representing rectangles. And so this means that, again, everything that is a rectangle also has four corners. Now, all squares have four corners. For this to be a valid syllogism, the entire circle representing squares needs to stay completely inside the circle representing four corners. Because there's no way to move the square circle outside of the four corner circle while staying completely inside the rectangle circle, this is a valid syllogism. Okay, our next one, no tigers have mustaches. So again, we need a circle representing mustaches and a second circle representing tigers, but because this says no tigers have mustaches, these circles are not allowed to touch at all. Next, I do not have a mustache. So now the X representing me cannot be inside the circle of things that have mustaches. And then the next statement, I am not a tiger. For this syllogism to be valid, the X can't be inside the tiger circle while still being outside the mustache circle. So, obviously here you can move the X inside the tiger circle while keeping it outside the mustache circle. So this is an invalid syllogism. Here are our syllogisms, some fish lay eggs. So we need an egg circle and a fish circle, but these ones have to be overlapping a little bit, but they can't fit completely inside each other, although they do still need to be touching. The reason for this is that we need a visual representation of some fish lay eggs and some fish do not. So some portion of the fish circle needs to be inside the egg circle, and some portion of the fish circle needs to be outside the egg circle. Next, we need to have some birds lay eggs. Again, we draw a similar circle labeled birds, partially inside the egg circle and partially outside the egg circle. The next statement, some fish are birds. For this to be true, there has to be no way for the bird circle to not touch the fish circle at all, while having part of the bird circle be inside the egg circle. Because we can move the bird circle over here so that it's not touching the fish circle at all, it does not have to be true that some fish are birds just because some fish lay eggs and some birds lay eggs. So this makes the syllogism invalid. Next is all paper is flat. So we need a circle, our larger one representing things that are flat, and a smaller circle representing paper, with the paper circle completely inside the flat circle. Some flat things are white. So now we need a white circle, which partially goes inside the flat circle and is partially outside of the flat circle. Therefore, some paper is white. Now, for this to be a valid syllogism, we need to make sure that the white circle must touch the paper circle with the white circle overlapping with the flat circle. This again is not the case because we can move the white circle so that it still overlaps with the flat circle but is not touching the paper circle. So that makes this syllogism invalid. Next, some lizards are green. So we're going to have the same kind of overlapping where lizards and green touch partially, but they do not fit completely one inside of the other. Next, all lizards are reptiles. So for this, we need a larger circle representing reptiles that goes completely around the lizard circle. Some reptiles are green. For this to be true, we can't have the reptile circle be able to be completely outside of the green circle. Because it's impossible to move the reptile circle completely outside of the green circle while still having the lizard circle partially inside the green circle, this is a valid syllogism. There's no way to move the reptile circle so that it does not touch the green circle, because it completely surrounds something that already overlaps with the green circle. Some Japanese people eat rice. So here we're going to have two overlapping circles, Japanese and rice. And the part that overlaps represents Japanese people that eat rice, and the part of the Japanese circle that does not overlap with rice represents Japanese people who do not eat rice. George Takei is Japanese. So somewhere in the Japanese circle, we need to have an X that represents George Takei. And we'll put it there. George Takei eats rice. So, for this syllogism to be valid, we can't put the X somewhere where it's inside the Japanese circle and outside the rice circle. But there's a large portion of the Japanese circle that does not touch the rice circle. So it is possible for the George Takei, the X representing George Takei, to be moved outside of the rice circle while still being inside the Japanese circle. So this is an invalid syllogism. Next, all dogs have fur. Again, our dogs are completely inside a fur circle, and no cats have fur. So we need the cat circle to be completely outside of the fur circle. Then the statement, no dogs are cats. It's going to be impossible for the cat circle to touch the dog circle with the cat circle outside the fur circle and the dog circle completely inside the fur circle. So this is going to be a valid syllogism. Some tables have 4 legs. So we have a table and a 4-leg circle where they overlap slightly. And then no tables are chairs. So our table circle needs to be completely disconnected from a chair circle. For the syllogism to be true, we have to make sure that there's no way the chair and the 4-leg circles can touch at all, while still keeping the chair and table circles separate. But it's possible to move the chairs to overlap with the four-leg circle, so this is an invalid syllogism as well. Now we're going to get into a discussion of a sound syllogism, or sound logic versus unsound logic. So, if you remember from last time, the important part about having a sound argument is that the arguments all need to be true, and the conclusion needs to be true, but the logic also has to be valid. So if you have an unsound argument, what that means is either the claims and conclusion are false, or the logic is invalid. So we're going to get into that next. So all Americans live in Manhattan. So we need an American circle completely inside a Manhattan circle. And then Manhattan is in New York, so all of the Manhattan circle needs to be inside of a New York circle. All Americans live in New York. So for this to be true, we can't have any portion of the American circle outside of the New York circle. Now, this is valid logic that is actually impossible to do. However, the statement, all Americans live in Manhattan, is false. So the conclusion is also false, because there are obviously other Americans that don't live in Manhattan. I, for example, am American and do not live in Manhattan, so that proves that this statement is false. So although the logic is valid, the argument itself is unsound because it contains a premise that is false. And the conclusion is also false because of that. Now, our statements in the next syllogism, all lawyers are doctors. So we need a lawyer circle completely inside of a doctor circle. No lawyers are mice. So for this, we need a mice circle that does not touch the doctor circle, or the lawyer circle, at all. And then, no mice are doctors. So for this to be true, there has to be no way for the doctor and mice circles to touch, while still keeping the mice circle completely outside of the lawyer circle. However, it is the case that you can actually move the mice circle into the doctor circle, but keep it away from the lawyer circle. So this is invalid logic. Now, what's interesting about this is that even though the logic is invalid, all of the claims are true. Anyone who is a lawyer has something called a Juris Doctorate. So, by definition, all lawyers are doctors. And it happens to be the case that there is not a single lawyer that is a mouse. There's also no mice that are doctors, but that's not because all lawyers are doctors. That has something to do with mice not being able to have human jobs. So, all the claims in the syllogism are true, as is the conclusion, but the logic is invalid, so this is an unsound argument. You would need to change the argument in some way to make the same claim and still have a good argument. All humans breathe air. So here we're going to have humans inside of an air circle, indicating that everything that is a human is something that breathes air. Now, air contains oxygen. So, we have an oxygen circle completely around an air circle, basically so that anything that is air contains oxygen. All humans breathe air. For this to be a valid syllogism, the human circle can't be moved outside of the oxygen circle while staying completely inside the air circle. So there's no way to move the human circle, so this is a valid syllogism. Each of these claims is also true, so this is an example of a sound argument. Because all humans do breathe air and all air contains oxygen, that does mean that all humans breathe oxygen, and since each of those claims is true, as is the conclusion, and the logic of the argument is valid, this is an example of a sound argument. Our next one, all trees are tall. So we need a tall circle completely surrounding trees to indicate that there are no trees that are not tall. And another circle for buildings, also completely inside the tall circle because of the statement, all buildings are tall. And then the conclusion, all buildings are trees. So for this to be true, we would have to make sure that there's no way for the building circle to be outside of the tree circle while staying inside the tall circle. But this is one of the circles that we can move to keep all the major and minor premises true, but the conclusion does not have to be true because of those premises. So this is invalid. And in addition, all of the claims made in this syllogism are false. So there are tall trees, and there are small trees, and there are small buildings, and also no building is a tree, actually. Or there would be very few cases of a tree that is a building if you consider something like a tree house to be a building. Part of that building is built out of a tree. So this is both invalid and untrue. But just the fact that it's invalid by itself is enough to make the argument unsound. I think this is our last one. All dogs are mammals. So we need a dog circle completely inside a mammal circle. No mammals lay eggs. So for this, we need eggs completely outside of our mammal circle. No dogs lay eggs. For this to be true, it has to be impossible for the dog and egg circles to touch, which is the case, so this is a valid syllogism. Now we need to look at each of the claims to determine if all of these things are true. And in this case, all of them are true. So dogs are examples of a mammal, and mammals do not lay eggs by definition, and so that automatically makes it impossible for a dog to lay eggs. So this is a sound argument. Okay, so that's it for the homework. Hopefully everyone was able to follow along with that and work through the syllogisms to determine if they were valid or not. So now we're going to move on to different kinds of logical fallacies. The ones we find in syllogisms are logical fallacies called non sequiturs. But these are not the only kind of logical fallacy that you can have, as we'll see in a moment. So, just as a brief reminder, syllogisms are logical arguments containing three statements: a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. In a syllogism, if the first two claims are true, the conclusion must also be true if the syllogism is valid. So, our two examples that you should probably be familiar with: all people are mortal, Socrates is a person, Socrates is mortal. This is valid. In contrast, all cats are mammals, I am a mammal, therefore I am a cat is invalid, because I can be a mammal and not be a cat. For example, humans are mammals and not cats. So these are two examples of syllogisms, one with correct logic and one with flawed logic. There are, however, some limitations to syllogisms. So, logical fallacies and syllogisms, if you remember these are called non sequiturs, are fairly easy to find, and you can work through them in a pretty simple way just by drawing a diagram of whatever assertions the syllogism makes. The issue is that not all of the claims made in syllogisms are as easy to evaluate as ones like Socrates is mortal or I am a cat. For one, there's no reason to actually make those kinds of assertions because no reasonable person would argue against them. When you try to apply some more controversial issues to the format of syllogisms, it becomes a lot less clear if the conclusion drawn from the syllogism is true. This is one example of one of these claims. People use drugs to get high. Getting high is immoral, therefore drugs are immoral. In this case, the logic works. There's no fallacy here. The issue is that it's possible to disagree with one of these premises. Some people, for example, might believe that getting high is not immoral. And so if you reject the minor premise, that gives you grounds to reject the major the conclusion as well. Remember that syllogisms only work if you accept both the major premise and the minor premise. When both of those are accepted as true, the conclusion must be true. However, in a valid syllogism, if one of the premises is incorrect, that automatically makes the conclusion incorrect as well. So, this is where the problem comes from when you try to put controversial issues inside of a syllogism. If I reject one of the premises, that automatically makes the conclusion untrue. So that's why we see logical fallacies in a lot of other formats, and syllogisms are not a very common form of argumentation. Let's get my slide. syllogisms aren't really very useful for actual debates because people don't debate over things that are simple matters of fact, or they really shouldn't, but that doesn't stop people from doing it. If you're at all familiar with politics in the U.S., it's a very unfortunate state of affairs, but anyway, in an ideal world, people would not debate things that are simple, observable facts. Typically, people debate things that are more susceptible to influence by opinion. So you can't argue with the fact that the sun is round, but you can argue, for example, whether or not using drugs is immoral. That's something that people can actually debate reasonably. So that's why most debates that you see in the real world don't look like syllogisms, because syllogisms don't work that well for things that are susceptible to people's opinions. And so when you have arguments outside of a syllogism, fallacies in the logic that supports those arguments can be more difficult to see. When you have invalid logic in a syllogism, it looks pretty ridiculous and it can lead you to some very absurd conclusions. Unfortunately, when you have logical errors in real life, they can be quite depressingly effective. So I'm going to show you an example now of one of those logical fallacies.
Right now, today, as a candidate, he supports federal taxpayer funding for Planned Parenthood. I disagree with him on that. That's a matter of principle, and I'll tell you. You are the single biggest liar. You probably are worse than Jeb Bush. You are the single biggest liar. All right. This guy lied. Let me just tell you, this guy lied about Ben Carson when he took votes away from Ben Carson in Iowa, and he just continues. This guy will say anything. Nasty guy. Now I know why he doesn't have one endorsement from any of his colleagues. All right, John, I get to respond. Pick from the buffet there. He's a nasty guy.
So there are a lot of different kinds of logical fallacies. Some of them that I'm going to talk about today in this video are the ad hominem fallacy, appeal to ignorance, false dichotomy, slippery slope, circular reasoning, hasty generalization, appeal to hypocrisy, causal fallacy, appeal to authority, and the bandwagon fallacy. I'm going to go into much more detail to describe each one, and we're going to start off with the ad hominem fallacy. So just some background on the ad hominem facility and where the name comes from. So ad hominem is it's Latin for to the man. An ad hominem fallacy is when an argument is dismissed by attacking the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. So the clip I showed earlier is an example of an ad hominem fallacy. It's taken from the debate for the Republican nomination in the 2016 election in the United States. So in this clip, you can see all the different things that Trump does that are that constitute an ad hominem fallacy. So first, Ted Cruz stated that Trump supports funding for Planned Parenthood. To that claim, Trump responds by saying that Ted Cruz is the biggest liar and a nasty guy. The problem is that Trump did not address Ted Cruz's claim. Instead of reacting to the statement that Trump supported Planned Parenthood, or supported funding for it, he instead decided to call Ted Cruz a liar and a nasty guy. This is entirely irrelevant to whether or not Ted Cruz's claim is true. It doesn't matter if Ted Cruz is a liar or whether he's lying now, this is still a logical fallacy because he attacked the person instead of addressing the argument. This is an error in reasoning. Next is the appeal to ignorance. So the appeal to ignorance is claiming that something is true because there is no proof that it is false, or if you claim something is false because there's no proof that it's true. So, this is an example of an appeal to ignorance. There is no proof that God does not exist, so God must be real. Or, you can say something a little different. There is no proof that I stole your car, so I didn't steal your car. the absence of proof of something doesn't mean that it's false. So for a long time, there was no way to prove that the Earth was round, but we later figured out that it was. So if someone were to say, there's no proof that Earth is round, therefore it's flat, is incorrect logic. The absence of proof doesn't change the actual facts. So that's why this is an invalid form of reasoning, why this is a logical fallacy. Stating that something is true or false based on an absence of proof or evidence to the contrary is not sound logic. Next is the false dichotomy. So this is also called the black and white fallacy because it basically treats issues as being very binary, having only two options. So when you present a situation and then pretend that there are only two options when there are actually more choices available, that is a false dichotomy. So an example of this is, if you don't have money for rent, you can either rob a bank or live on the street. I don't want to live on the street, so I have to rob a bank. Here, whoever's making this argument, hold on, I'll get to that in a second. You either support the war on drugs or you are a criminal. Now, in both of these cases, other options are ignored. So, in the first example, there are not literally only two options to deal with not having rent money. For example, you can sell electronics or furniture, get a roommate. You can do lots of other things besides rob a bank. And there are many other choices besides living on the street, and each of the options you can take to prevent lacking money for rent. Same thing goes for the second claim. You either support the war on drugs or you are a criminal. These two things are also not true. You can be opposed to the war on drugs for tons of other reasons and still not be a criminal. It's not at all the case that you have to be a criminal or you have to support the war on drugs. So there are lots of other options in between the war on drugs and being a criminal, so this is again another example of a false dichotomy. There are not just the two options presented, there are actually significantly more options. There are many other choices besides just what's being presented. Right, this is another sort of just explanation of what I said. So next is the slippery slope. So in the slippery slope fallacy, basically the approach is to state that a small step will lead to an unstoppable chain of events that lead to something very undesirable. And because of the unstoppable chain of events, it should be avoided to take the small step in whatever direction that they are arguing. So if, for those of you that have been living in the US for a little while, you may remember a time when gay marriage was not legal federally. A lot of arguments that people would make against gay marriage was a slippery slope fallacy. People would say, if we allow gay marriage, then next people will be allowed to marry animals. And then once they're allowed to marry animals, people will be able to get married to desks and trees and horses and all these other ridiculous, crazy things. And so they argued that because there would be no way to stop the progression from marrying someone of the same sex to marrying animals to marrying inanimate objects, we shouldn't allow same-sex marriages at all, because it will lead to marriages between people and animals and pieces of cardboard or whatever. And obviously there's a very clear thing to prevent that step, all those steps in between gay marriage and marrying animals. Another example that's not taken from real life that I just sort of made up. If people are allowed to smoke cigarettes, they'll start smoking weed, they'll do harder and harder drugs to keep getting high, and pretty soon everyone will be on heroin, overdose, and die. So the argument in this claim assumes that all smokers start doing drugs, and they will continue to do drugs until they die. Many smokers, however, never do drugs, and a lot of people that do smoke weed never move on and progress to harder drugs. So it's not at all the case that just because somebody smokes cigarettes, that means it'll grow and turn into mass heroin overdose deaths. So starting the one step does not automatically and inevitably lead to the very grim future that they've painted in this scenario. So that's why this is a fallacy. Circular reasoning is when one of the premises of an argument is the same as its conclusion, or you basically you justify a conclusion by stating the conclusion again. So an example of circular reasoning is, I am the best because I am better than everyone else. This is circular reasoning because the definition of the best thing is the thing that's better than everything else. So the evidence provided for the claim, I am the best, is just restating simply, I am the best. I'm the best because I'm the best. And so to sort of visualize that, you can look at this diagram here. I am the best. Why? I'm better than everyone. Why? I'm the best. And it can go in a circle like that over and over again because the evidence for the claim, I am the best, is the same claim. I am the best. So this creates a circle, and that's where this logical fallacy gets its name. Now, for hasty generalization, this is when you make a broad conclusion on a very small sample. An example of a hasty generalization is to say, my first iPhone broke after 2 weeks, Apple products are terrible, and I'm never going to buy one again. So, in this scenario, after buying one single Apple product, this person decides that not only are all iPhones poorly made, but so is anything else that Apple produces. The problem is that it's entirely possible that Apple products are very high quality, but they happen to receive a defective one. Also, the quality of the design of iPhones does not necessarily influence the quality of other products made by Apple. So this person doesn't actually know enough about Apple products in general to say outright that everything Apple makes is terrible. You may have heard in the past someone say that generalizations are bad, and you shouldn't make generalizations, but that's not actually true. The spirit of that claim is that you shouldn't make hasty generalizations. So you shouldn't make broad claims without sufficient evidence to support what you're saying. In this case, one experience with an iPhone is not substantial evidence to say that everything Apple makes is bad. However, there are other examples of generalizations that are perfectly fine. So, the fact that there is gravity everywhere on Earth is a generalization, because not literally every centimeter of the Earth has been explored and measured by people. There are parts, for example, very deep in the ocean where people have never been. And there's also places very high in the air where people have never been. Right, so we would have to be at every single place on Earth and determine if in that exact spot there is gravity. We haven't done that. But we can still say quite comfortably that gravity exists everywhere on Earth. Gravity doesn't suddenly disappear at random places on the planet. So, we generalize because we haven't been to literally every piece of Earth. We generalize and say that there is gravity everywhere on Earth because we've been to enough places on Earth, people in general have been to enough places on the planet to determine that there is gravity everywhere. That's a generalization we're making without visiting and studying literally every piece of the planet, but we've studied enough to comfortably expand what we have evidence for to include the entire planet. That's an example of a reasonable generalization that people can make safely. But the example I have here about denouncing all Apple products because of one bad experience with an iPhone does not does not have enough evidence to make it a reasonable claim to make. And so that's why it's a hasty generalization. Next is the appeal to hypocrisy. So other names that refer to the appeal to hypocrisy are also called whataboutism, where people essentially just say, well, what about this? Or tu quoque, which is Latin for you also. So in an appeal to hypocrisy, what someone does is basically insinuate that a certain belief or a certain claim is wrong or invalid because someone else is guilty of doing something similar that is also wrong. So saying something like, you can't criticize me for cheating because you cheated too, is an example of an appeal to hypocrisy. What that essentially does is when someone criticizes you, you say, if you make that criticism, you are a hypocrite. That's what appeal to hypocrisy means. You say, you're a hypocrite if you criticize me for doing bad things because you did bad things too. And I have a video here that also explains that and gives another real-life example about the use of whataboutism and how effective appeals to hypocrisy can be.
You could imagine him saying, well, I'm not the first politician to criticize the press. What about Hillary Clinton? What about Barack Obama? What about Bernie Sanders? And that actually brings us to Trump's second technique, something called whataboutism. It's the practice of changing the subject to someone else's perceived wrongdoing. Now, Trump does this all the time, most famously when he was asked why he hadn't forcefully condemned the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, and this was his response.
What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt? What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem?
Well, actually, no, because a Nazi killing someone with a car is so heinous, any other issues that might be up for debate, under any other circumstances, kind of have to wait their turn. You can be wearing Crocs with socks, but if you're using those socked Crocs to kick Hitler in the balls, do you know what? I'm suddenly not so fucking focused on the footwear. Now, this technique of saying, what about, is actually an old Soviet propaganda tool. And the reason it is dangerous is because it implies that all actions, regardless of context, share a moral equivalency. And since nobody is perfect, all criticism is hypocritical and everybody should do whatever they want. It is a depressingly effective tool, which is why, on Trump's favorite network, you hear it all the time.
The mainstream media focused on the Trump campaign and allegations of collusion with the Russians. But what about the Democrats' possible ties to Moscow?
Former National Security Advisor General Michael Flynn investigated for his private meeting with Russia. But what about Hillary Clinton?
The media wants to call into question the credibility and the trustworthiness of this administration. But what about Benghazi? What about the blatant lies that the Obama administration told us? What about the fact that Ben Rhodes bragged about lying to the media and the public about the Iran deal? What about the fact that Jonathan Gruber basically said the American people was stupid?
Okay, stop. Because here is the thing. None of the errors those people may have made in the past excuse the Trump administration's actions. A defense attorney could not stand up in court and say, maybe my client did murder those people, but I ask you this, what about Jeffrey Dahmer? What about Al Capone? What about the guy from The Silence of the Lambs? Arrest my case here, people. Arrest my case. The problem with whataboutism is it doesn't actually solve a problem or win an argument. The point is just to muddy the waters, which can make the other side mad.
When someone makes an appeal to hypocrisy, this implies that the bad things that somebody else did are irrelevant because other people also did bad things. And so this is why it's a logical error, because when someone does something wrong, it doesn't automatically get negated just because people have done other bad things that are similar to that. So that's why this tactic of addressing criticism is fallacious logic. Now, causal fallacies come in two different forms. One of them is called a post hoc fallacy, where it states that because something happened after something else, it happened because of that previous event. And we'll get to a couple more examples of this. The next one is cum hoc ergo propter hoc. And what this means, again, this is Latin, which means with this, therefore, because of this. And that states that because there's a correlation between two things, one of them caused the other. Again, we'll get another example of this as well. So the post hoc fallacy, one example of this is after I got my child vaccinated, they were diagnosed with autism. Vaccines cause autism. Now, here, what this person does is suggest that after an event, another event occurred, so the first one caused the second one. And this is a growing an increasingly popular claim, which is really disheartening, but this is an example of a real-life version of a post hoc fallacy. So lots of people have children diagnosed with autism after they receive a vaccine. But this completely ignores the fact that symptoms of autism start to appear and develop in children around the same time that they are scheduled to receive specific vaccines. But that's not the case that children receive autism from a vaccine. It just happens that after the vaccination, they develop symptoms for autism. So, if you say that something automatically happened because of a previous event just because one happened after the other, then this is a post hoc fallacy. The important thing to remember with the post hoc fallacy is that it is one event happening before another event, therefore the first event caused the second. This is different from the Coombe-Hock fallacy, which implies that there's a correlation, so one of the events caused the other. So I have some data here, basically showing the number of firefighters that go to a fire and then the amount of damage that the fire caused. And so what I'm going to argue is that firefighters cause a lot of damage. All right, so when more firefighters show up at a fire, more damage occurs. We should send fewer firefighters to fires so that they cause less damage. And by the data on the graph, it looks very much like that could be the case. But a more reasonable approach to this is that the size of the fire determines the amount of damage that is caused in the fire. And the number of firefighters that are sent to put out the fire are also determined by how big the fire is. So, in this scenario, we're incorrectly claiming that there's a cause-effect relationship between the number of fires, there's a cause and effect relationship between the number of firefighters and the amount of damage that a fire causes. The actual cause of the amount of damage in a fire is the size of the fire itself. And the number of firefighters that appear is determined by the size of the fire as well. So, when you say that because there's a correlation between two things, one automatically causes the other, that is not necessarily the case either. So the Coombe-Hock fallacy is actually one of the most common fallacies that people see. In order to eliminate a Coombe-Hock fallacy, you need to look at other potential causes for an event, or what else could cause the correlation between two things, instead of automatically assuming that one causes the other. Next fallacy is an appeal to authority. So, in an appeal to authority, you state that a claim is true because of the authority of a person saying it, especially when that person's authority is irrelevant to the claim. In this example, 4 out of 5 dentists say that brushing your teeth leads to a fulfilling life. So dentists certainly are an authority on the topic of dental hygiene, but they may not necessarily know what makes a fulfilling life. So they do not have the authority to make the claim that a person has a fulfilling life, or that something can make you have a fulfilling life. They can only make claims about brushing your teeth. Another important thing to remember about appeals to authority is that even in a case where somebody's authority is relevant, that does not automatically make what they are saying true. Because somebody with authority on a given topic could make a claim that is false, but people believing them just because an authority figure says so doesn't make that claim true. Right? The truth of a given claim is irrelevant to anything other than whether or not the claim is true. So if you believe what somebody says just because they have some kind of authority or they're an authority specifically on a topic, doesn't mean that you should listen to them automatically. You need to verify that what they're saying is true, regardless of the amount of authority that they have. Another example of this is that I am an authority on language. I'm very well educated about how language works, and that's why I teach English. I am not, however, knowledgeable about things like art or history. And so if I tried to use my authority as an expert on language to validate claims about history or art, I would be committing an appeal to authority fallacy by saying, you should believe me because of all the education I have about this thing that I'm not educated about. So, when someone with authority does make a claim, you should make sure first that their expertise is relevant to the claim they're making, and also independently verify that the claim they're making is true, to avoid committing an appeal to authority fallacy. I think this is the last one. The bandwagon fallacy is when you state that a claim is true because a large number of people believe it is true. So, hopefully everyone's familiar with the book Frankenstein. Just as some background to the book Frankenstein. Basically, a doctor creates a monster. The doctor's name is Frankenstein, and the monster doesn't really have a name. The monster is just referred to as the monster. But most people refer to the monster as Frankenstein and not the doctor. So, just remember, Frankenstein is the doctor and the monster is the monster. So everyone says that the monster in Frankenstein is named Frankenstein. So many people would only believe this if it was true. So, again, something is not true just because of the number of people that believe it. In this case, as I explained, Frankenstein is the doctor who created the monster, and the monster does not have a name. Just because people believe that the monster is named Frankenstein does not change the fact that the monster does not have a name. So, this again is just a reminder that just because a lot of people believe something, that does not make that thing true. So, this again stresses the importance of independently verifying whether or not something is a fact before you decide to accept it. So the number of people that believe something is true has no effect on if something is actually factually accurate. Okay, so those are all of our other fallacies. So just as a quick review, we have the non sequitur fallacy, which we used a lot in syllogisms, but also ad hominem, appeal to ignorance, false dichotomy, slippery slope, circular reasoning, hasty generalization, appeal to hypocrisy, post hoc and cum hoc, appeal to authority, and the bandwagon fallacy. I will provide everyone with lots of opportunities to practice these, identifying these fallacies a little bit more so that they can get a better grasp of the meaning of the fallacy and get some practice recognizing fallacies in real life scenarios. So that is all I have for now, and I'll have the homework up on Blackboard tomorrow, so make sure you're keeping an eye out for that, and I will see you, well, you'll see me, and I'll have another video up in a few days. All right? Bye.